Julian Vance was 26, running on fumes, and slowly being crushed by two invisible monoliths, a suffocating mountain of student loan debt surpassing $120,000, and the paralyzing pressure of his doctoral thesis. An anthropology candidate at a prestigious Chicago university, Julian's dissertation was titled Mythos in the Machine, the Digital Evolution of the American Cryptid. He spent his days bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of his monitors, analyzing how ancient fears of the dark had been repackaged into internet creepypastas, Reddit threads, and viral TikTok urban legends. To Julian, monsters were entirely sociological. They were copes, algorithmic anomalies, and fascinating data points. They were not, under any circumstances, real. But academia is a ruthless master. With his deadline looming 6 weeks away and his apartment a cacophony of sirens, thin walls, and his roommate's terrible techno music, Julian's focus had completely fractured. He was desperate, so, when he stumbled upon a heavily discounted, end-of-season writing residency at the St. Jude Retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, he didn't hesitate. It promised absolute isolation, a private cottage, and, most importantly, zero cellular service. A digital detox, a place where the internet couldn't reach him, forcing him to finally synthesize 3 years of scattered research. The drive into the Appalachians should have been scenic. But to Julian, a creature of concrete and fiber-optic cables, it felt like descending into a sprawling green lung. The towering skeletal pines crowded the two-lane highway, their heavy canopies choking out the mid-October sun. He watched with a rising irrational panic as the bars on his smartphone dropped from 5G to LTE, then to 3G, before finally vanishing into no service. The modern umbilical cord had been cut. St. Jude Retreat was tucked into a valley so steep it felt like a geological trap. The main monastery, a sprawling Gothic stone monolith built in the late 1800s, was choked with invasive ivy. Julian's university advisor had casually mentioned it was condemned due to toxic black mold in the 1970s. Julian's accommodation was a small, modernized guest cottage in the eastern wing, looking wildly out of place against the crumbling stone. He was greeted by Alistair, the estate's sole groundskeeper. Alistair was a man who looked carved directly from the Appalachian bedrock, leathery skin, a tangled gray beard, and eyes the color of washed. "How Denham, you are the city boy studying ghosts," Alistair rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. He handed Julian a heavy brass key. As he reached out, Julian noticed the older man was missing the pinky and ring fingers on his left hand. The scars were jagged, puckered, and old. "Digital folklore, actually," Julian corrected with a polite, academic smile. "The sociology of fear." Alistair didn't smile back. He looked past Julian, staring deep into the tree line where the shadows were already lengthening. "Fear ain't sociology out here, son. It is just survival. Keep your door locked. The woods get loud at night. Don't go looking for the source." Julian dismissed the warning as classic rural theatrics, a local playing up the spooky atmosphere for the city kid. He unpacked his life into the cottage, his sleek MacBook, an ergonomic office chair he'd brought in the trunk of his car, an espresso machine, and his noise-canceling Sony headphones. For the first 3 days, the isolation was intoxicating. Julian wrote furiously, churning out thousands of words on how modern society uses the concept of the Slenderman to process feelings of urban alienation. But by the 4th day, the silence began to curdle. Without the ambient hum of city traffic, sirens, or the digital ping of notifications, the silence of the woods became an oppressive physical weight. It rang in his ears. To compensate, Julian started playing low-fi hip-hop tracks at maximum volume, but the psychological toll of the profound emptiness began to manifest. The environment seemed to mirror his internal anxiety. A massive low-pressure system stalled over the mountains, bringing a suffocating freezing fog that pressed wetly against the cottage windows. Foreshadowing, though Julian ignored it, was everywhere. On his 5th morning, he found deep, vertical gouges in the oak tree outside his window, starting 10 feet up and tearing down to the roots. Bear, he told himself, though the physics of it made his stomach knot. A distinct smell like stagnant swamp water, raw sewage, and struck matches would occasionally drift through the cottage vents, lingering for seconds before vanishing. Then came the night of the storm. Late on a brisk Thursday night, pale silvery moonlight struggled to filter through the heavy iron grates of the cottage windows, battling against the torrential rain. Julian was hunched over his glass desk, the harsh blue light of his laptop screen illuminating his bloodshot, exhausted eyes. Outside, the incoming storm caused the wind to shriek through the skeletal branches of the ancient pines, scraping them against the stone walls with a sound horrifyingly similar to fingernails on a chalkboard. Julian rubbed his temples, took a swig of a lukewarm Monster energy drink, and checked the digital clock. 1:45 a.m. He slid his noise-canceling headphones over his ears, desperate to block out the shrieking wind, and pressed play on a white noise track. But 5 minutes later, an anomalous sound breached the artificial quiet. It wasn't a sound he heard. It was a sound he felt. A heavy rhythmic thudding vibrated up through the laminate floorboards, traveling straight up the legs of his ergonomic chair. It was accompanied by a distinct wet noise. A sickening slop, drag, like something impossibly dense and meaty being pulled across the cobblestones of the courtyard. Julian frowned, pausing his music. He pulled one headphone off. Alistair, his logical brain scrambled to rationalize. The old man must be out in the storm, dragging a fallen branch or a dead deer off the pathway. But the dragging sound was too heavy. It grew steadily louder, moving methodically down the exterior hallway until it halted with brutal finality directly outside Julian's heavy oak door. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of a massive fist testing the structural integrity of the wood. Julian's heart slammed against his ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across his neck and soaking the collar of his hoodie. The knocking stopped. It was instantly replaced by a sound that would haunt Julian's nightmares for the rest of his life. A wet, frantic scratching noise. It sounded like decaying, waterlogged leather rubbing violently against the doorframe, searching for a seam. The air in the room, previously stifling from the baseboard heater, plummeted in a matter of seconds. A wave of freezing, unnatural cold washed over Julian, so intense that his neck's terrified exhale plumed in the dim light like cigarette smoke. The ambient smell of his coffee was violently overpowered by a nauseating wave of sulfur copper and rotting meat. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling so violently he could barely push his chair back. The brass doorknob, catching the glare of the laptop screen, slowly, agonizingly turned. A deafening crack echoed over the storm as the deadbolt sheared straight off the frame. The heavy door groaned open. A colossal, nightmarish figure squeezed its way into the cramped modern cottage. The creature stood well over 7 feet tall, its spine arching sharply to avoid scraping the ceiling. Its flesh was the sickly mottled color of a rotting pumpkin, textured with deep weeping fissures and dark necrotic patches. It dripped black, viscous fluid onto the pristine IKEA rug. Its eyes were twin pits of glittering, chaotic malice. They didn't look like animal eyes, they looked like the dead static of a broken television set, catching the blue light of the room. Its jaw hung unnaturally low, seemingly unhinged, revealing rows of jagged, translucent teeth that looked exactly like shattered glass. Panic completely seized Julian's throat, paralyzing his vocal cords. The sophisticated academic who had spent 3 years dissecting the myth of monsters found his worldview utterly shattered. This was no algorithm. This was no internet legend. This was primordial physical death standing in his bedroom. He desperately calculated his odds. The bathroom window too small. The door blocked. The massive beast took a lumbering step forward, emitting a wet, gurgling rattle from deep within its sunken chest. Foul-smelling, blackish foam spilled from its lips, hissing chemically as it burned small holes into the laminate floorboards. It raised a massive, multi-jointed arm. Survival instinct, raw, unthinking, and entirely unacademic, took over. Julian remembered the heavy serrated tactical camping knife he had bought on Amazon, which currently sat on his nightstand, used solely for cutting apples and opening packages. He lunged backward, his trembling fingers blindly scrambling over the wood until they closed around the cold, textured handle of the blade, with a primal, terrified yell that tore at his vocal cords. Julian thrust the blade forward as the creature lunged, slashing wildly at its midsection. The steel struck the beast's torso with brutal force. But instead of sinking into yielding flesh, a brilliant shower of orange sparks erupted in the dim room. A harsh, grinding metallic screech echoed out, as if Julian had violently struck a solid slab of granite with a crowbar. The kinetic shockwave ran up Julian's arm, nearly dislocating his shoulder, and the knife clattered uselessly to the floor. The demon shrieked, a deafening, multi-tonal wail that sounded like twisted metal and human screams, and swiped its massive claws downward. Julian threw himself to the floor, scraping his knees raw as he rolled frantically under the glass desk. The creature's claws missed his skull by a fraction of an inch. Instead, they caught his laptop and the thick, weighted blanket draped over his bed. The MacBook shattered into plastic shrapnel, and the heavy blanket was shredded into ribbons, filling the air with thousands of tiny glass beads that rained down like bizarre hail. The creature roared, looming over the desk, preparing to drag Julian out by his ankles. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the agony. But then, a new sound cut through the storm. Clang, clang, clang. It was a heavy, resonant bell, ringing out from the direction of Alistair's cabin across the courtyard. It was rhythmic, urgent, and incredibly loud. The creature froze, its static eyes darted toward the open doorway. It let out a low, frustrated hiss that smelled of ozone. Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, it turned. With surprising, terrifying speed, it lumbered out into the black night, Julian lay paralyzed under his desk, listening to its heavy, wet footsteps fading into the howling wind of the woods, moving steadily toward the sound of the ringing bell. Julian did not move for 6 hours. He lay wedged under the desk, violently shivering, clutching a broken piece of his laptop keyboard, his mind completely broken by adrenaline and terror. When the sun finally rose, casting a deceptively warm, golden light into the ruined room, he crawled out. The cottage was a disaster zone. The smell of sulfur still clung to the fabric of his clothes. There, slashed through the ruined weighted blanket and biting 4 inches deep into the mattress itself, were 5 impossibly deep claw marks. The edges of the fabric weren't just torn, they were scorched to a crisp, smelling of burnt hair. He didn't bother changing his clothes. He grabbed his car keys and his wallet, leaving his ruined electronics, his clothes, and 3 years of thesis notes behind. He was out the door in less than 2 minutes. As his tires spun in the mud on the way out of the retreat, he slammed on the brakes at the front gate. Alistair was standing there. Unlocking the heavy iron barrier, the old man looked haggard. His clothes were soaked, and a fresh, bloody bandage was tightly wrapped around his left bicep. Alistair looked at Julian's pale, traumatized face. He didn't ask about the destroyed cottage. He didn't ask why Julian was leaving 5 weeks early. He just looked at Julian, offered a knowing, incredibly grim smile, and gave a slow nod. "I told you," Alistair rasped, leaning heavily against the gate. "The woods get loud." Julian floored the accelerator, tearing down the mountain road, not stopping until his phone pinged furiously with 20 missed texts and the beautiful, chaotic skyline of a gas station came into view. 6 months later, Julian Vance officially dropped out of his doctoral program. The academic world puzzled over the sudden departure of their brightest digital folklorist. But Julian offered no explanations. Through obsessive, manic deep web research, utilizing university archives before his credentials expired, Julian discovered the terrifying truth. St. Jude's had never been a monastery. It was built in 1892 as a containment site, masking a long-suppressed history of unexplained hiker disappearances, brutal animal mutilations, and local legends of a Granite Ghoul. Alistair wasn't a groundskeeper, he was a warden, and the retreat wasn't abandoned, it was a feeding ground. Julian changed his major to accounting the following semester. He moved into a high-rise apartment on the 34th floor in downtown Chicago, surrounded by concrete glass and millions of people. He revels in the siren noise, sleeps with all the lights on, and strictly refuses to own a noise-canceling headset. And for the rest of his life, he never set foot near a forest again.